Inside this room, all of my dreams become realities, and some of my realities become dreams.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You are listening to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. Here are your hosts, Alan Sanders and Walt Murray.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. It's a podcast where we break down and celebrate the films of Gene Wilder 1 minute at a time. I'm your host, I'm Alan Sanders.
And I'm your co-host, Walt Murray.
And we usually bring in guests to talk about certain minutes of the movie, but it is our distinct pleasure to bring you this bonus episode of Season 1, where we are breaking down the film Young Frankenstein. And it is our pleasure to welcome biographer Brian Scott Mednick, who wrote a book about Gene Wilder, one of the very first biographies. In fact, maybe the first true biography of Gene Wilder, Funny and Sad. Brian, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks, Alan. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule to join us. Let's just start at the very beginning. Picking a character like Gene Wilder had to have had its challenges right from the beginning, because it's not like he's your typical bad boy Hollywood actor with a lot of dirt and a lot of stories and a lot of gossip. He was kind of a private guy.
Very, very private, yes. I had a lot of things going for me and a lot of things going against me. When I started writing the book, it started out as a research paper in college. So for me, this was a no-brainer because I knew so much about Gene Wilder. So I wrote a 22-page paper. My professor, who himself was a biographer, loved it and said I should consider turning it into a book. And I thought about it for a little bit and thought it would be just too much work. Then because there never had been a book written about him, I thought, well, I don't want to go into a bookstore and see that someone else wrote it, so I'm gonna tackle it. And when I started writing it, this is before the internet and everything. Any information I had was mostly through TV interviews I'd recorded over the years and newspaper pieces and interviews. I even worked with a genealogist in Milwaukee, where Gene Wilder was from. And she got me the most amazing documents that even now with all the technology we have, I don't think I would have been able to get online. Immigration papers for his grandparents and his father, death certificates and birth certificates. So it really was a lot of detective work. I'm sure if someone was to start a project like this now, because of all the information that's out there about everything, it would probably take a lot quicker. But the challenge was convincing people to publish it, because when I was shopping it around initially, Gene Wilder was in his 60s. He had basically retired from acting. And the kind of sentiment was that, he wasn't a hot property at the moment. But I got the nicest rejection letters, because publishers would write me. I actually got one that said, "I love Gene Wilder. I loved your manuscript. If someone else published it, I would buy it. But we can't do it."
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. So, it's a very nice rejection letters. I almost wanted to get one that just said it stinks and that's it.
Now, when you talk about rejection, not to interrupt, but since you talk about rejection, did you not also get a short letter or response from Gene himself?
Yes, because initially I wanted it to be an authorized biography. I wanted him to cooperate, which, looking back, is the most ridiculous idea because of how private he was. So I basically spent a year just working on the first 4 chapters. And once I had them to the point where I was happy with them, I spent about a month writing a letter to him. And he was in England doing a play at the time. So I sent it to him there, waited about a month. I didn't get a response. I sent him a follow-up letter. And he sent me a very nice letter saying he was grateful I wasn't one of these people out to do a hatchet job on him. And he said he couldn't cooperate because he'd been asked to write his own autobiography. And it would be like he was competing against himself or we were competing against each other. He said, "I hope you understand." And that was it. So I didn't think I'd get anyone to talk to me, to give me interviews. So I basically shelved it for about a year. And then I realized Gene was a very sensitive person and he hated to hurt anybody's feelings. So he used that as his excuse, but he was not working on his own autobiography. He didn't write his memoir until many, many, many years after that letter. So when I realized, he was just gently turning me down, I decided to start, finishing the book. And surprisingly, a lot of his colleagues did give me interviews. So it worked out.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the process of writing, because I've attempted several great American novels and have yet to finish a single one of them because they are so daunting and there's just so much to try to keep track of. And obviously a biography is a little different, but you still have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and you're trying to do justice to a character, or in this case, the story of a man. How did you decide that you were going to be able to tackle this? I know you said you started off with just a paper, but there's a difference between writing 22 pages and writing nearly 300.
Yes. Think about when you write about someone who's still alive, basically the ending is always changing because things happen to them, they do things. So really right up until the final submission to my publisher, I was still making changes. Just, colleagues of his, had died, or, just things were happening. So there's always something to change. So that's a challenge when writing about someone who's alive. But yeah, it is a story, and I tried my best to tell the story in a way that was engaging if it was a novel, something that would make people want to see what's next. And the nicest compliments I've gotten were from people who were not particularly big Gene Wilder fans, who found it very interesting. So the people who were already fans already had an interest in it. Just the goal is to try to tell the story, try to be as objectionable as possible.
Objectionable or objective?
Objective, yeah. It's been a long day.
Yeah, because if you're being objectionable, we may have some issue.
I objected to everything you did. I'm going to tell the truth finally. You try to be objective, and he was not perfect. No one's perfect. It's a largely flattering book. One of the nicer reviews I got was someone said it was admirable but not sycophantic. So I think that was good. There was stuff that I actually could not put in there for legal reasons because my publisher said you're going to get sued. Well, you're going to get sued and I'm going to get sued, he said. So there was stuff that I couldn't put in. Nothing, considering what celebrities do these days. It's so tame, but I wouldn't have wanted it to be the focus of the book and take away from anything. So it's not in there. But again, I think it's a largely flattering portrait. I mean, he was a great guy.
Yeah, and Brian, it seems like, today every book that comes out about someone in Hollywood has to be a hit piece. And,
right.
You've just got to go and cut the knees out from under the people. And, right. As we've looked at Gene and his work and a little bit of his life, it seems like for him, Connecticut was the right place to live. He's just kind of a quiet guy. He wasn't a big Hollywood person. Even his interviews, he seems very subdued and, very reserved. Is that kind of the same feel that you got from the other people that you interviewed who knew him and had spent time around him?
Yes. I'd say almost everyone I interviewed who worked with him said whatever film it was, whatever project it was one of the highlights of their career. And he created such an environment, especially when he was directing the movie. One of the people I interviewed was Fred Schuller, who is the cinematographer on a number of Gene's movies, both that he starred in and directed. And the last film they did was Haunted Honeymoon, which was the last film Gene directed. And he said it was such an enjoyable experience. He said he still hopes the phone would ring and Gene would call and say, I'm doing another project, I'm directing something. Because it was just, he said he created a family on the set. Everyone felt like they were family. They went out to dinner and, he really set the tone for everybody. And that's kind of the consensus I got from a lot of the people he worked with, especially on the films that he directed himself. And it did get to the point where I was like, come on, someone has to say something. Come on, I'm trying to sell books. Come on. But no, everyone spoke very, very highly of him.
So, and it seems from your book, based on, what I've been able to read so far online, because I knew we had just kind of touched base and I'm in the middle of this project anyway of this podcast, but it seems like you spent a pretty good portion of the book kind of breaking down each of his films, starting all the way back with The Producers all the way through. But there is the opening where you sort of talk about Gene's life. So let's focus on that for just a moment.
Sure.
We know that the story Gene told, and we mentioned this in our very first week, Walt, when we were opening the podcast, is that Gene Wilder got scolded kind of by, not really scolded, but the way he tells the story, by a doctor who came to work on his mom or to care for his mom, who basically scared Gene into thinking that if you ever upset your mom, you could end up killing her. Brian, tell us a little bit about how that really was the start of what we have today as not only the gentle actor, but just the absolute crazy comedian and wonderful performer that is Gene Wilder.
Well, when he was 8 years old, his mother had a heart attack, and the doctor literally said, "Don't ever get angry or it might kill your mother." And it terrified him, but the doctor said a second thing. He said, "Try to make her laugh if you could." And he didn't think of himself as a performer at that point, but he tried to make her laugh. And he said he knew he succeeded when she peed in her pants. So he then wanted to be, his idols were Jerry Lewis, Sid Caesar, and now I forget who the other one was. I don't have the book in front of me. I don't even remember. But he wanted initially to be a comedian or a comic actor. Then when he was 16, he saw Lee J. Cobb in the original production of Death of a Salesman, and he thought, no, this is what I want to be. So he wanted to be a serious actor then. But it was really his mother being sick that really prompted him to get into performing and comedy. And when he was a little bit older, when he was 11 years old, he saw his sister in a recital, and she was doing Guy de Maupassant's The Necklace, and he just was so in awe that the audience stayed quiet, and for 30 or 40 minutes, however long she was up there, they just looked at her and focused on her, and he thought that must be the closest to being God that you can be. So he went to her acting teacher afterwards and said he wanted to study with him. Teacher asked how old he was. He said, "I'm 11. He said, "Come back when you're 13 and I'll take you on." And the day after his 13th birthday, he went to the acting teacher. He studied with him for 5 years. And then he went to the University of Iowa, where he studied theater.
And you can tell, and we've mentioned this before throughout we're doing Young Frankenstein, and we'll get to that film in just a minute, but you can tell that a lot of these actors that were used by Mel Brooks had a background in theater, just their ability to improv and be on screen for so long without the modern day hyper cuts and close-ups. They could stay on a master shot for 2 or 3 minutes of a scene and let it play out almost like a play on stage. So his early years, not just wanting to please his mom, but he learned a lot on stage, and in not just, like you said, dramas, but just interacting in Shakespeare and sword fighting and learning how to do basically all elements of stagecraft.
Yes, well, he was a very good fencer. He actually taught fencing when he was younger, and he learned it at the Old Vic Theatre School in Bristol, England, and most prominently, he used that fencing in The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother. He really was a very good fencer.
Let's talk a little bit about getting involved in film. I think if the story is right, and you correct me since you're going to know a whole lot more than we do, it was a production on stage where Anne Bancroft was in the show and Mel Brooks was in the audience were dating Anne Bancroft at the time, and he was watching the play, and that's when I think is when Gene Wilder caught Mel Brooks's eye.
Yeah, well, Mel Brooks would hang out backstage quite often. The play was Mother Courage and Her Children by Bertolt Brecht, and it wasn't a very successful show, but it was probably the most pivotal moment in Gene Wilder's life and career, because if it wasn't for that show, he would have never met Mel Brooks. And they struck up a friendship, and one night, Gene was at their Fire Island home, and he said, "I'm writing this screenplay. It's called Springtime for Hitler." And, he says, I'll read it to you. So he said, if you want, I'll continue writing it with you in mind. And he said, yes, because he hadn't even done Bonnie and Clyde yet. He'd done nothing. He'd only done television and theater. So he occupied most of the 60s doing theater, a lot of Broadway credits. And he didn't hear from Mel Brooks for several years. He thought Mel Brooks had forgotten about him, but he was doing the play Love on Broadway, and Mel Brooks knocked on the door. Hadn't seen him in several years, and he said, "You didn't think I forgot, do you?" And he offered him the role.
That's such a great story to just, hear about their paths crossing like that. And Mel Brooks, even as a young and very green director in Hollywood, being able to identify talent and pick the people that he could use in the movies that he was going to be making, especially early in his career.
Yes, and it was kind of the unofficial Mel Brooks stock company. Gene and Madeline Kahn and Dom DeLuise and so many great actors who appeared in so many of Mel Brooks's films. So when Mel Brooks wanted Gene for the role and cast Zero Mostel, he told him, he said, Zero doesn't know who you are. You're going to have to audition for him. And Gene thought he had the role, and the idea of auditioning just drove him crazy. So they met at an office, and Mel Brooks introduced Gene to Zero, and Zero grabbed him and gave him a big kiss on the lips. And that kind of broke the ice, and they did the reading, and a half hour later, Mel Brooks called Gene and said, Zero loved you. The role is yours. And Mel Brooks said The Producers would have been a very good movie with Zero Mostel and another comic, but he said Gene Wilder made it a classic. And you and your listeners, if you look on YouTube for Mel Brooks's Oscar acceptance speech when he won Best Original Screenplay for The Producers, he thanked Gene Wilder 3 times at the end of the speech, and they cut to Gene in the audience, and it looked like Gene was, about to wipe a tear from his eyes. So Mel Brooks was very, very grateful for Gene Wilder making The Producers the kind of movie it was.
That's fantastic. What a great story. Let's chat about his introduction into the film world, because it did come, I guess, like you said, television. Initially, I think he was doing a television show of Death of a Salesman. Is that what he was doing with television?
It was ironic that he was geared towards being a dramatic actor after seeing Lee J. Cobb in Death of a Salesman. And then he got to play opposite Lee J. Cobb in the role of Bernard. It was a 1966 TV production, won a lot of Emmy Awards, very, very good production. So that was a very big deal for him as far as television. And the following year is when he did what's actually his first film, Bonnie and Clyde.
All right, so we move forward into Bonnie and Clyde. He doesn't have a whole lot of screen time, but he makes a memorable performance with the time he's given, and especially making a friendship with Gene Hackman, which will play into the podcast we're doing right now. Chat a bit about what you know about that casting and then his friendship with Gene Hackman. Well,
it would seem that his entrance into movies would be through Mel Brooks, but it was actually Warren Beatty and Arthur Penn. They each claimed credit for, they'd seen Gene on Broadway, and they each thought he would be great for the role. And it was a small role, as you said. He played an undertaker who the Barrow Gang briefly kidnaps. And it really was the start of his career, in the sense that that role wouldn't have made him a star if it wasn't for The Producers. But you could see even then, that early in his career, the hallmarks of what made a classic Gene Wilder performance. He really was unique. I mean, I don't think anyone had seen that kind of acting, and all the more interesting that he played a comedic role in a very, very grim, downbeat movie. So it was a small role, but it was a very memorable role.
A comment I've made early on in our own podcast here was Gene had a way of coming across in such a way with such genuine heart and a twinkle, and even when he's yelling at you, he makes that indelible impression. And I think that's what you saw in Bonnie and Clyde. There was something about him that just stands out the whole time he's on screen.
Yes, that I totally agree with that. There was also that fear that often seems to be something in his character. There's a great deal of fear that then manifests itself in either something that's very funny or a slow buildup of tension where he's very calm, and then he erupts into this explosion, and it's comic gold when he would do that.
So talk about the relationship with him and Gene Hackman.
I know they were friends, but I really didn't know the extent of how friendly they were. I know they played tennis occasionally. So I think they were pretty good friends, but I don't have any particulars or any Gene Hackman, Gene Wilder stories. But I I think what happened was they were playing tennis, and Gene Hackman asked if he could do the role of the Hermit.
There was definitely, according to the notes that we had for our season 1 Young Frankenstein, the idea that Gene Hackman, having not been a comedic actor, sort of said, so what are you working on? And they kind of were chatting about how this idea he had with Mel Brooks, and they were polishing this script of this young Frankenstein, sort of a Frankenstein story, but with a happy ending. And Gene Hackman said, well, I'd love a tiny part if you got something, maybe something funny, but, just tiny. I don't want anything big, just if you got something. And turned out he ended up playing the Hermit and purposely wanted to be uncredited when the film first came out because he didn't want his name to be a distraction from Gene's project.
And for the people who were seeing it for the first time in 1974, Gene Hackman was a huge star at that point. And I think everyone just, did kind of a double take and said, that's Gene Hackman. So I think that added so much to the movie, and it's often one of the most talked about scenes. Gene Hackman really did a pretty incredible job with that role.
All right, we won't be able to get into every movie, but one of the things we decided, Walt and I, when we wanted to do this podcast based on the film work of Gene Wilder, we designed our logo, we designed everything around the idea of what we consider his 3 iconic roles. That of Dr. Frankenstein in Young Frankenstein, that of the Waco Kid in Blazing Saddles, and of course, Willy Wonka in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. And let's talk about the first of those 3 because Willy Wonka did come first.
Yes, Willy Wonka was 1971, and it was not one of Gene Wilder's favorite movies. And he had said a number of times over the years that he didn't want to be remembered for Willy Wonka. He didn't want his gravestone to say, "Here lies Willy Wonka." He said, "Dr. Frankenstein, I wouldn't mind." So he really wanted to be best remembered for Young Frankenstein. But as I pointed out, since his death, he really had no say over his legacy because every story, every obituary highlighted Willy Wonka as his primary role. So he wouldn't have been thrilled about that. But for a lot of people, they grew up in that movie, and Gene Wilder was Willy Wonka. And every incarnation since, whether it was the Johnny Depp movie or the Broadway show, or they're now doing another movie that's going to be about the early years of Willy Wonka, nobody can compare to Gene Wilder. He made that role he owned that role. There is no other Willy Wonka, and I happen to disagree with him because I think it is one of his best movies and one of his best performances. I'm still amazed that he was not nominated for an Oscar for that. I just think it's such an amazing performance. I just think if Mary Poppins could win Best Actress Julie Andrews could win for Mary Poppins, this was certainly an Oscar caliber role.
I don't disagree. I've often said that even though Blazing Saddles may be my favorite all-time film that he's in, that the best I think I've ever seen him be on screen. And it's close because Young Frankenstein is so darn good, but there's something about Willy Wonka that I just love, and that character will always stick with me. And I do know that even though that wasn't the role he wanted to be necessarily always remembered for, I do know that when he was sick later in his life, he wanted to hide it as much as he could because he didn't want kids and the parents who had grown up as kids watching him play that role to think of Willy Wonka as being sick, and that he didn't want to tarnish that memory that those, now parents, and again, second and sometimes third and fourth generation now of youth being introduced to the movie, to ever think that Willy Wonka was anything other than what they saw in the film.
That's true. He used to go to the supermarket in Connecticut, and the little kids would recognize him, and their parents would point out that was Willy Wonka. And really, again, highlighting what a private person he was. It's not surprising that he kept his illness secret for so many years. About a year before he died, he was photographed at the U.S. Open, and he looked so frail and so unwell that a lot of people were speculating maybe his cancer had returned. And I just took it that he was just not aging well, and he did look very frail, but I really didn't. Maybe I just was in denial. I didn't want to think that anything was really seriously wrong. Because when he did die, I was shocked. I did not expect it. I did not know he was that sick.
Yeah, I think
he did keep it private for that reason. He wanted people to remember him for who he was when he was healthy, and he didn't want the kids to be sad.
Yeah, I was surprised as well. And, usually you hear over the course of time that somebody's sick and then they pass away, but it totally came out of the blue. And I think caught everybody, including some of his friends, by surprise that he had been that sick.
Well, there had been so many false stories over the years about his health that I never took any of them seriously. I even gave an interview when the book, I think right before the book came out, to one of the really, really sleazy tabloids. And I was very naive because I'd given interviews to the Inquirer over the years, and the Inquirer's kind of gotten a decent reputation compared to what it was known for years ago. But this is one of the really terrible tabloids. And I gave them an interview, and they told me when it would be out, and I went to the supermarket and I'm reading it and I'm just livid. They totally twisted my words around and turned it into a Gene Wilder's final days story. And this is before he even had Alzheimer's. He was not sick. And I was just infuriated. I felt terrible. So when he was spotted at the U.S. Open looking so frail, people were starting to say, I just didn't buy any of it because there had been those stories before. So it was a surprise. In fact, just real quick, it was interesting. I got a text from an old friend, and it just said, "I heard the news, so sorry." And just instinctively, I knew what it was. And I was furiously Googling and couldn't find anything. And then finally I saw it. And then another friend texted me shortly after that and said, "Did you hear about Gene Wilder?" And I was just stunned. I was in shock.
And the irony here, we are recording this interview on May 29th. We are exactly 21 months since Gene Wilder passed away. 3 months from now, we will hit his 2-year anniversary. What Walt and I sometimes talk about, we on a different medium rather than the podcast, but on radio, we sometimes, kind of do that sort of ha-ha chuckle when people say a celebrity passes away and somehow it affects you as if like you're best friends with them. We're like, really? You're going to be sad all week because a celebrity died? But then when Gene Wilder passed away, it hit both of us. And I think that's probably why we've decided that this was going to be the niche we were going to head, rather than look at just a franchise, a Star Wars movie franchise or a Raiders of the Lost Ark franchise. We said, let's look at the work of Gene Wilder, because ironically, it did affect us. And I had never met him. I'd never written him. I know, Walt, I don't think you had either.
No.
But that was one of those deaths. And maybe it's because that childhood memory of way back, my first memory of Willy Wonka followed by the Waco Kid, has been with me since I was a preteen. And right. I feel like I've known Gene Wilder. I've known him my whole life. He doesn't know who I am. He never knew who I was. But, so I guess now I have a different perspective when celebrities pass away, because this is the first one that sort of, hit me in the gut.
Yeah, the reaction to his death was unlike any that I can recall for anyone else of his ilk. And I was very moved. It was the top story on most of the newscasts, and it was on the front page of almost every newspaper. And I knew that he was beloved and that he had a large fan base, but somehow, I don't know, I just didn't think the coverage would be like this. I mean, the coverage for Jerry Lewis's death was not like this. It was really extraordinary, and I was very, very moved by it. And it really just showed how much he meant to so many people. And I wrote on my website, I was too upset to really write anything when it first happened. I waited a couple of weeks to write a proper, I wouldn't call it a tribute because I wrote so many tributes to him while he was alive. But I said I felt like I lost a friend. That's the way I felt about him, because let me put it this way. A lot of people who knew me or know me very well, because I was so involved with writing the book and trying to get it published, and it was basically 15 years plus of my life. I had friends who said, I really used to like Gene Wilder before I met you. Now I'm sick of him. And I took that as a huge compliment.
Would you stop talking about Gene? There's other actors out there.
Exactly. So that's why I took it. Again, I was so moved that he was given such coverage, and so respectfully as well. And just the fact that AMC Theaters released Blazing Saddles in theaters nationwide after he died. I never saw that for any other actor that I can recall.
No, and I think that part of why it was such a surprise, and probably one of the reasons why it was so endearing, is that you would never expect to see him wiped out in a DUI accident or stabbed in a bar fight. That just wasn't his personality. You looked at him as the guy who you wanted as your next door neighbor or a friend of your dad. And he always came across as that. And even though when you look at his acting ability and the craziness that he brought to the screen, and the fact that when he was in a movie, I mean, he could own that movie if he wanted to and be the dominant character. You still got the sense that he was the nice guy and the guy you wanted to be friends with. And nobody likes to see that happen to the nice guy. They get to the end of their life and it's just sad. It's hard to watch. And two, for many people our ages, I watched his movies over and over again. I can't tell you how many times I've seen Blazing Saddles or Young Frankenstein and how I can look back and go, oh yeah, at this birthday party or with these guys in college, we sat and watched Young Frankenstein. So he was one of those guys who was kind of always there with us. So makes it that much more shocking.
Exactly. But to put a positive spin on it, aside from the final 3 years or so of his life, his later years were probably the happiest of his life because he really was madly in love with his wife, Karen. He died 10 days before what would have been their 25th wedding anniversary. It was his fourth and longest marriage and definitely his happiest marriage. And he retired from acting. He led a very quiet life, writing, and he described his average day as he'd be in his study, he'd write for a few hours, he'd come out, have a cup of tea, give his wife a kiss, have a little lunch, continue writing. And he caught up with the times and he would email old friends. And he'd say around 4:00, he'd start winding down and then think about what they were going to do for dinner. And he watercolor painted, and Karen was taking tap dance lessons and he took tap dance. So they really it was a very un-Hollywood kind of life that he led in his third chapter, if you will. But he was happy because of it. He was very happy.
Yeah, all you're doing is making me love this guy even more. I mean, if I could say, how can I chart my career? Start on stage, go to television, eventually be a box office star, and at the point where you decide, you know what, I'm at that point where the scripts aren't as fun anymore, I don't like the kind of direction Hollywood's going. How about a third career? I find the woman of my dreams, settle down a quiet little neighborhood, and I can just write, and I can do an interview when I want, but I can do it at my own pace, my own time, and I can live the life I want to live for however long I've got left. I mean, and take tap dance lessons. That's a pretty cool way to chart your whole career, honestly.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the final chapter of the book, he was not one of these stars who craved attention. He was not big on going to parties or premieres, or he didn't crave having a star in the Walk of Fame, which he never had, which I think is a crime. Or he didn't care about awards or things like that. He was very humble, but it was genuine. He wasn't one of these actors who pretends to be humble. He was really humble.
Well, let's continue with these big three. Let's pull back into Willy Wonka for a moment. I know the story very well because I just love this movie so well, but you are our guest and we want to give a chance to highlight the knowledge you have, and then we want to make sure we plug your book and everything for all of our listeners. Tell the story of how Gene Wilder made a demand of Mel Stewart before he would agree to play Willy Wonka.
He agreed to do the movie. In fact, he so knocked them out at the audition that Mel Stewart just couldn't help himself and just said, "You got it. We'll work something out. You got it." And the only actor they saw before him was Joel Grey. And physically, Joel Grey fits the description of how Willy Wonka is described in the book. But Gene came in and just knocked them out. And he then said to Mel Stewart, though, he said he wanted to do this scene where when he first appears, he comes out with a cane and everyone quiets down. That, oh my God, Willy Wonka is a cripple, and he slowly walks with the cane, as we all know, and then the cane gets stuck in a cobblestone, And he does the somersault, and he's fine. And Mel Stewart says, "You really want to do that? You won't do the movie unless we do that?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Because," and his reasoning was absolutely brilliant. He said, "Because you don't know, you can't trust Willy Wonka throughout the whole movie. You never know whether he's being truthful or not. And that's a wonderful way to set up the film, to have him enter like that, because you never know whether or not he's being truthful." And it was the entrance was absolutely brilliant. And that's kind of a theme with Gene Wilder. You'll find a lot of his movies, he added stuff to the script. He didn't get credited, even though he should have, because of Writers Guild rules. So there are always things that he did to make the character his own. And real quick, maybe we'll save that for Young Frankenstein, but there's a similar thing he did with Young Frankenstein.
Yeah, I'm kind of going with these in order here, because the big three really do happen within the span of 3 years. You've got Willy Wonka in 1971, and then your back-to-back huge 1974 blockbusters for both Mel Brooks and Gene Wilder. But as we wrap on at least Willy Wonka and that story, to me, that it's like that moment in Jaws when you first see the shark and Roy Scheider says, "You're going to need a bigger boat." I mean, it's an iconic moment of cinema. It's like everyone knows it. And when Gene Wilder visualized this gag, this coming out and fooling the crowd and fooling us in the audience, because we're in the audience too. I mean, we're the ones thinking, hey, we're finally meeting Willy Wonka. It's like 40 minutes into the movie or so before we even see him. And to just make that statement and have that presence of mind as a performer and a storyteller to say the only way this works is we've got to fool him visually right from the very beginning, and then I'll have him in the palm of my hands the rest of the way. And that's why I love that performance. It is a brilliant, well done, and like you said earlier, should have been considered for an Academy Award.
Absolutely.
So as we move from Willy Wonka to Blazing Saddles, do you have any other stories about the cast or Mel Stewart or anything else from your book that would be of interest to our readers about Gene Wilder working on Willy Wonka, outside of the fact that he didn't necessarily want to be remembered as the Candyman, but anything else?
Well, I actually had dinner with Mel Stewart, and he was very nice, and he just raved about Gene, and he said the kids loved him, and he gave the kids a lot of attention. They all wanted his attention, but he said he was always slightly aloof. And he said they think that was on purpose, because he said the really great actors kind of become their characters off screen. So he said he was always kind of just a little aloof, but they loved him. And it was filmed in Munich, Germany, and the food wasn't particularly good there. They'd go out to eat every night, and trout, for some reason, was the tastiest dish. They found themselves eating a lot of trout. And they were filming during Thanksgiving, and Gene paid for a whole turkey dinner for the whole cast and crew. And Mel Stewart pointed out that one of the things Gene brought to the character was, if you'll notice throughout the movie, his hair gets wilder and wilder, if you will, and frizzier and more out of control. And he said Gene Wilder did that purposely as the movie goes along, and as Wonka really does seem to get a little more off kilter. So Mel Stewart raved about him, and it wasn't until after I interviewed him that I found out that that Gene Wilder thought Mel Stewart was "quote unquote" a maniac, because he would yell at people on the set. Never yelled at Gene, but he would yell at people. And he said Mel Stewart didn't realize that you can't yell at one person and have it not affect the other people on the set.
Right.
So he thought Willy Wonka would have been a better movie with a different director.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, on the heels of Willy Wonka, there's some other things that he's done, but we're going to move to the next big of the big three. And I think what's funny about this role of the Waco Kid, it may be the only role that I can think of that would be in terms of like hit pop giant movies, not some off movie that he did or some of the smaller roles, but in terms of giant blockbuster where he may be one of the most subdued and normal characters in the entire movie. He doesn't have that blow up scene. He doesn't have that, how can I yell to, like, how do I set my personal amplifier to 11? He's just subdued, and yet he's so memorable all the same. Blazing Saddles.
That might be the only role of his where he's like you said, he's subdued throughout and never has that moment where he explodes. And it's interesting because he's so pivotal to the movie, and he does seem like the most the one who's the most together of everyone in that film.
What do you know about how Gene got even pulled into Blazing Saddles?
I'm sure you know the story, but for your listeners, I'll quickly go over it. He was not supposed to be in the movie. Mel Brooks had shown him the script, and Gene wanted to play the Waco Kid, and he said, "No, you're wrong for that. You're too young, too Jewish." He said, "You should play the Harvey Korman role, the Hedley Lamar," and Gene said, "I didn't think he was right for it." So Gene wasn't going to do the movie, and Mel hired Gig Young. Well, he initially wanted Dan Daly, the old Western actor, to do it, and Dan Daly was just in failing health, and his eyesight was going, and he just couldn't do it. And at one point, Mel Brooks offered the role to John Wayne. And
really?
Yes. And John Wayne read the script, and he said to Mel Brooks, he said, "This is hysterical. I love it. I'll be first in line to see it when it comes out."
I remember that. I'll be first in line to see it.
Yeah.
I'm just not going to be in it.
He said, "But I can't do this. This is too dirty. I'm John Wayne."
He has a point.
I mean.
So he finally cast Gig Young. And Gig Young, as we know, was a very troubled person. And he was a hardcore alcoholic. And he was kind of on the wagon. And he showed up the first day on the set. And, Mel yells action. And all of a sudden, has green foam coming out of his mouth. And Mel's like, "Boy, this guy's really giving it his all. Look at it." And he had to be taken away by ambulance. He was going through serious withdrawal, and they lost a whole day of filming. Gene was in New York about to fly to England to do The Little Prince, and Mel calls him and says, "You got to do me a favor," and Gene said, "Why was the foam green coming out of his mouth?" Well, Mel Brooks said, I don't know, it was green." So he says, "Call Stanley Donen, who was the director of The Little Prince, beg off, see if you can." So he called Stanley Donen, and Stanley Donen said, "Look, go help Mel Brooks out. I'll put all of your scenes at the end of this shooting." So he flew to LA the next day. It was over the weekend. He got fitted for his costume and got to know his horse and everything. And Monday morning, he was upside down in the jail cell. And Mel Brooks said he learned a valuable lesson. He said, "Typecasting stinks." He said, "I was wrong about Gene being too young, too Jewish." He said, "Just hire the best actor." And he said, not only did Gene Wilder help make the movie what it was, he said he's also a very good friend. He said, not only is he a genius, he's a really good friend. So if Gig Young had not had his problems, it would have been a very different movie, I think.
You talked about the entrance and how Gene always is thinking about, making that splash on the screen and memorable in Willy Wonka. I always find myself, especially if, let's say, we've had the gathering with a bunch of people with a lot of cocktails, and you wake up the next morning, and I find myself going, And then my wife will say, "What?" I'm like, "I said the drunk in number 2 is awake." I find myself doing that all the time. And it's such a memorable moment because he makes that entrance where he's coming to, and they purposely do the camera upside down from his perspective when he first meets, Black Bart, the black sheriff, and that great exchange of, "Are we awake?" He's like, "I don't know. Are we black?" and only Gene, I think, with that genuine, the twinkle in his eye, that heartfelt, it didn't sound like he was having a negative connotation with the lines. It was just, "I just want to make sure, did my eyes go out or are they working?" Right. And it's a wonderful opening to that character.
It's another example of a great entrance, exactly.
So that movie obviously was a big box office success, but I think while they were waiting to see how well that would be received in early 1974, another project was in the works that was going to be launching in the same year, but at the very end of the year. Talk about having perfect bookends to the box office season 1974. Let's talk a little bit, which is really what our podcast season 1 is all about, the creation of a Frankenstein story with a happy ending. Young Frankenstein.
Yes, well, Gene had started writing it while they were doing Blazing Saddles, and his agent at the time, Mike Medavoy, called Gene up and said, how about a movie with you and Marty Feldman and Peter Boyle? And Gene says, where'd you come up with that idea? He says, because now I represent you and Marty and Peter. And Gene said, well, that's a great artistic basis for a film. And he said, I do have something. So he sent him over some pages, and Mike Medavoy said, this is great. And how about we have Mel Brooks direct? And Gene said, you're whistling Dixie, because Mel's not going to direct anything he didn't conceive of. Well, the next day, Mel Brooks calls and says, what are you getting me into? And Gene says, nothing you don't want to get into. So he convinced Mel Brooks that it was a worthy project, and Gene wrote the first draft. They wrote the subsequent drafts together. And it was an amazing year. February 74, Blazing Saddles, and December 74, Young Frankenstein. To have one of those movies in a year is amazing. To have both of those movies in the same year is just extraordinary.
Do you know the story of during the creating of the actual draft of the script, when they would go over to Gene's sort of, I guess, makeshift apartment, when they would, Mel Brooks would be editing, and then come back and work on some dialogue and work on the script, about when they got really, really heated and Mel Brooks stormed out of the apartment?
You tell me your version, because I have my own.
Okay, and I want to find out how close mine is, because what I heard was after Mel Brooks, yelling and ranting, stormed away from the writing session, went down the street, and Gene sort of thinking like, wow, he lost his top, whatever, he'll blow off some steam. About 20 minutes later, the phone rings, and it's Mel Brooks on the phone, and he's calling from a phone booth, and he's like, hey, you got to be careful letting maniacs into your house like that. I could hear you guys yelling all the way from here. Don't you know it's kind of dangerous to do that? And Gene said that was sort of Mel's way of apologizing for being an ass.
I do recall that story, which I don't think it was a major fight, because they really only ever had one. Well, they only had really two fights, and they were both over Young Frankenstein. And just like he insisted on the entrance in Willy Wonka, he was very passionate about the putting on the Ritz number in Young Frankenstein. And Mel Brooks thought it was a ridiculous idea, and they didn't need it. And Gene got red in the face and just was so upset that he said he was nearly in tears. And Mel Brooks relented and said, you're very timid and quiet, and you must think this is really such a good idea to fight for it this way. And ironically, the putting on the Ritz number is one of the most famous scenes in the movie.
Yep, Mel saying, if you're going to argue this much for it, and I see you want it this bad, let's go ahead and do it. And yeah, I'm glad it's in the film. I mean, I can't imagine this movie without the putting on the Ritz number.
Exactly.
What about, and those are the two individual fights that we've talked about. One.
The other fight was many years later, when Mel Brooks decided to do the Broadway musical of Young Frankenstein, and he called Gene Wilder up, and Gene said, over my dead body. And he just didn't think it should be done as a musical. But Anne Bancroft had recently died, and Gene felt really bad for Mel and said, he gave in and said, okay, do it. So those are the only two times they fought.
Definitely. Yeah, the big ones.
Going a little crazy and storming out of his apartment, yeah.
What I wanted to ask is, when you were doing your research for the book, and we know that of all of Mel Brooks's movies, if he's not the star, he's in his movies. And the noticeable absence of at least being on camera, we know he's in it, just audibly. Do you know how that conversation went, and what was the reaction? How did Gene Wilder convince Mel Brooks you are not getting a cameo in one of your movies?
I don't know how the discussion went, but I think it would have been very distracting if Mel Brooks was in that movie, because Mel Brooks just didn't fit into Transylvania black and white. And it's a good thing he wasn't in there. And it was their last film together, their last collaboration. And the reason being that Mel wanted to start acting in his movies, and he really enjoyed doing that. And then Gene started directing his own movies. So they remained great friends, but professionally, Young Frankenstein was the end of their collaboration.
Well, if you're going to end on a high note. They certainly did.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I wish he and Richard Pryor had done the same thing.
I hear you. We've got a few more minutes of your time. I'm trying to keep this right at an hour if we can. I mean, it's up to you. We've got as much time I can edit out whatever. But I got to ask you, we're not sure how the conversation went to convince him to not be in the film, but I think it's universally accepted. It's probably one of the better moves in terms of not letting that kind of like goofy, hey, the director sort of played a little part and gets out of the movie and distracts from the story. Let's talk about the fact that they never did have another collaboration. In all of your research, was it ever explained why they chose to sort of stay friends but go separately in terms of their creative directions?
Well, they had toyed around after Young Frankenstein of doing a Jekyll and Hyde spoof, but it really never got, it was never really serious. It never really got, I don't think anything was even ever put on paper. So that never happened. And again, it was just their careers were kind of going in different ways. Gene, right after Young Frankenstein, he directed his first movie, The Adventure of Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, and he would continue to make a few more films as a writer-director. And Mel was doing his own movies as a writer-director, but also starring in them. And again, there were no hard feelings. It was just creatively, they were just going in different directions.
I guess the more important thing is I'd rather have a friend for life that I can bounce ideas off of than get into a creative spat and never talk again.
Exactly. And as you said, those three movies they did, it's an amazing trifecta. So maybe it was best that they ended with on such a high note.
Well, creatively, they did go two very different directions. You know, Gene did some more serious work later on, but Mel kind of went more for the slapstick, zany, over the top kind of stuff. So it was probably kind of a natural move for both of them to go those two different directions.
Yeah, the criticism Gene got for his first couple of movies as a director, the second being The World's Greatest Lover, was they felt he didn't go all out in terms of the way Mel Brooks was so naughty and, more. They felt he was more edgy and that Gene had a lighter touch. I say in the book, it's Mel Brooks would hit you on the head with a sledgehammer. Gene used a Q-tip. So Mel Brooks, the influence rubbed off on Gene Wilder. You can see that in the movies that he wrote and directed after Young Frankenstein. But he had also his own just different take on things. It was just a gentler kind of comedy, but still very funny. I think Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother and World's Greatest Lover are two great films. And they actually were pretty well reviewed at the time. And they hold up. And thankfully, took a long time for them to get on DVD, but they got on DVD, and thankfully Gene did the commentary. So for your listeners, if they haven't seen those films, they're on DVD, they're available, and the commentary is just terrific.
That's fantastic. I've mentioned several times before, I know it was sort of the off movie that a lot of people missed, but Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, I've always been a fan of. It's such a clever script and just such a great story. And you throw Madeline Kahn, Gene Wilder, Marty Feldman, Dom DeLuise. I mean, you've got some great talent all in a story. And I'm sure they were all very, very, open and allowing a now newbie director to let his work come out on stage. I'm pretty sure there weren't many fights on that set.
No, he was anxious to hang on to as many of those actors as he could. And I think Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother is one of his best movies, actually. It's a film I grew up on. I remember it used to be on television quite a lot. Late at night on Fridays, it was on, and I'd always get so excited to see it. And it's just a great film.
All right, Brian, I know we're almost out of time. I know Walt may have had a couple of other questions as well. We wanted to hit the big three since we started our podcast with Young Frankenstein. We're working through that movie, and we're going to hit all of the big three as well as a lot of his other movies, including the whole Richard Pryor and other things. And we don't have time enough of your time to go into the whole second phase of the comedy duo of Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. Maybe we can get back with you another time when we get closer to doing maybe one of those four films that, well, I think they did four together, I think. Yeah.
I think so.
Silver Streak. They did Stir Crazy, Hear No Evil, Steer No Evil. And then there was one that's sort of weird.
Yeah. Another You. And
yes.
Richard Pryor did it for the money. He admitted that. I don't know what they were thinking when they agreed to do that script.
Yeah, no. But I think we'll probably, if we were going to do all the Richard Pryor ones, we'd probably do the 3 good ones and leave that one for another day.
Pretend that one didn't happen.
Right. We're going to say they just did a trilogy of buddy films together.
Yeah. And you know what's odd, Brian, and I was going to ask you about this. You know, they do these buddy films together, but from what I understand, the two of them were not very close, that they really did not have much personal chemistry outside of acting. Is that kind of what you understand from your research as well?
Yes. When they did Silver Streak, they got along very well. They met just right before the filming started, and Pryor was a very difficult person, and he was very paranoid. He complained about Silver Streak, saying that there was some kind of, they had him in there because he was black. It was just ridiculous. And Silver Streak is maybe my favorite Gene Wilder film. And their chemistry was just terrific. And when they got together a few years later to do Stir Crazy, again, their chemistry on screen was just terrific. They bounced off of one another, and they were just great. They were magic together. But Richard Pryor his drug use was rampant during Stir Crazy. He showed up late on the set to the point where the film's budget went from $10 million to $15 million. And it got so bad that Sidney Poitier was considering replacing him with another actor and reshooting his early scenes. But he finished the movie. And after that, they really weren't in touch. But Gene Wilder did visit Richard Pryor when he was in the hospital after his accident. But then again, it was really no contact until they got together for See No Evil, Hear No Evil. And that was a very good movie. It wasn't in the same league as Silver Streak or Stir Crazy, but it was a very funny movie. And they had both mellowed at that. Well, Richard Pryor certainly had mellowed. So they got along a lot better. They hung out more while they were filming the movie. But again, they didn't socialize when they weren't working together. And by the time they did Another You, Richard Pryor was really, you could see it on screen. He was physically not well. He had multiple sclerosis, and you could see physically the toll it took on him. And Gene, again, didn't like to hurt anybody's feelings. He was very polite. And the reason he gave why they weren't friends when, they weren't filming, he said, I think we felt like, Abbott and Costello, we might have a fight and then we'd ruin the relationship. And that's really not the truth. That's Gene being nice. Richard Pryor was a hardcore drug addict. That's right. Why Gene couldn't be friends with him. He would be very sweet and nice, and then he'd be totally irrational and paranoid. Even See No Evil, Hear No Evil. During interviews, he was acting like he was so happy doing the movie. And then he wrote in his memoir, he said, I don't know what they were thinking. I just did it for the money. So that's kind of unfortunate. Yeah, that's just the way Richard Pryor was.
Wow. Well, again, there's so much that we could have to talk about. And again, as we start to maybe down the road move into those buddy movies, we may bring you back and see if you're interested in chatting more in depth about all of those individual flicks. Let's move it back to Young Frankenstein as we start to wind down. Any other stories that you have from your book, Gene Wilder, Funny and Sad? Any stories about Young Frankenstein that you might want to share?
We pretty much touched on a lot of the key points. Again, Gene Wilder wanted to be remembered for that. He considers it his best movie. And also, it was the most enjoyable experience he ever had making the movie. The set was just, you could see the bloopers online on YouTube, or even in the special edition DVD of Young Frankenstein. They had a struggle not to laugh during the takes. It was just such a fun set. Everybody just adored each other. And Gene was actually, the last day of filming, he was very sad. He didn't want to go home. And he said to Mel Brooks, he says, can we write some more scenes? I don't want to leave Transylvania. And Mel Brooks said, look, I got lighting to do. I got things to do here. He says, maybe go contact Mary Shelley. And he really was upset that this was coming to an end. Ironically, though, he was going through a divorce during that movie. So his private life was pretty tumultuous at that point. And he got along very well with Terry Garr. And after filming Rap, they were an item for a while.
Yeah, I heard that they became amorous for a little bit, but like everything else in Hollywood, it kind of went its way and fizzled out.
Yes, exactly.
All right. Brian Scott Mednick, author of Gene Wilder, Funny and Sad. Let's give you a chance now with all the knowledge you've just imparted to our listeners. How can people get your book?
It's available on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble's website, or through my publisher's website, bearmanormedia.com. And it's available, and thankfully it's been doing very well. There's been a lot of publicity lately for some reason about Gene, and it's very nice, and brings attention to the book, brings attention to him, and it's all very positive. So so your readers can check it out on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or bearmanormedia.com.
Well, Brian, thanks for joining us. We've kind of found that as we've had some younger people come in and they watch the movie and are really introduced to Gene for the first time, it's kind of an eye-opening thing for them of how funny he was, what a great actor he was, and how great these movies are. And so hopefully some folks will pick up your book and kind of find the same thing.
Yeah, I think what I read about it is you're going to get a good sense of the journey of Gene Wilder, especially through a lot of his film work on through the final days of his life. So, Brian, thanks again so much for taking time out of your schedule. And we hope that whatever reason that caused you to all of a sudden pop up on web browsers and things with, hey, there's a flashback to this interview, and here's this guy, and here's this book. I'm happy because I just happened to be sitting here in the studio, and it popped up, and I said, well, let me just learn a little bit more about this guy. And I just happened to Google and find an email address. I'm like, well, let's see if he'll actually even reply to some unknowns running a little podcast. But thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here on the Wilder Ride.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'd love to come back sometime, and thanks to both of you. I really enjoyed it.
All right. You have a wonderful rest of your evening, and take care.
You too. Take care. Bye.
All righty. Bye-bye.